Welcome to BitBlitz Horror. Tonight we're unearthing the Orphan's Curse, a tale of ancient evil lurking beneath an orphanage yard. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Now let's begin our descent into darkness. A gray sky loomed overhead as I wandered the orphanage grounds, my shoes sinking into the soggy soil with each step. The air felt unnaturally cold for the season, as though winter had decided to linger out of spite. I'd been assigned yard cleanup duty again, a punishment for a minor scuffle with another kid in the cafeteria. The shovel in my hands felt like an extension of my arm, and I let myself be consumed by the repetitive motion of digging small holes in the soggy ground to improve drainage. Yard work was dull, but at least it gave me a chance to be alone. Solitude was a rare treasure in a place where everyone shared bedrooms, bathrooms, and mealtimes. A dull ache throbbed in my shoulder as I pressed the shovel into the earth, turning the soil in uneven piles. That's when I felt the blade strike something unusually hard. At first, I thought it might be a rock. I jabbed the point of the shovel against it again, hoping to loosen whatever was beneath the ground. But instead of the dull clink of stone, a hollow thud reverberated upward, making my bones recoil. My pulse quickened, the sensation so unexpected that my hands trembled on the wooden handle of the shovel. I glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed or had come out to check on me, but the backyard was empty. Heart pounding, I dropped to my knees in the mud. Something was definitely buried below. I clawed away clumps of wet earth with my fingers, expecting perhaps a wooden board or an old tree root. But the texture was different, smooth, and intricately carved. Eventually, I uncovered a small chest, no bigger than a shoebox, bound in tarnished metal. Strange symbols covered its surface, winding around each other in sinuous loops that made my eyes hurt if I stared too long. Each swirl of the carving seemed to carry an unspoken promise of power, or maybe a warning of something far darker. I ran my fingertips over the engraved designs, not recognizing them. They might have been letters, animals, or something else entirely. Water dripped from my sleeves, tickling my wrists in a persistent reminder that I was half-drenched from working outside for so long. Curiosity tangled with apprehension in my chest. Every sensible thought told me to call an adult, to let someone else handle this discovery. But I was 14, old enough to figure it out for myself. At least that's what I told myself at the time. I pried at the latch, but it held firm. That sense of dread and excitement gnawed at me, more intense than I'd ever felt before. Something about the small chest felt alive, as though it recognized my touch. My heart thudded in my ears in a wild staccato. Eventually, I found a small seam in the lid where the metal binding looked weakened by rust. I wedged my fingers between the lid and the rest of the box and strained until, with a screech of protest, the latch gave way. The lid popped open, releasing a gust of foul-smelling air, as though it had retained ancient breath for centuries. Inside lay an object wrapped in decaying cloth. Brown spots dotted the material. I pulled back the rag and discovered a small statue made of dark wood, or maybe bone. Time had warped it into a crooked shape, almost like the figure of a person, if that person had limbs that bent at impossible angles. Hollow eye sockets formed the crudely carved face, and a row of triangular markings stretched across the thing's chest in an eerie pattern. My breath caught as I lifted it. The statue weighed more than it looked like it should, as though holding it placed a burden not just on my hands but on my soul. A chill skittered down my spine. A faint voice in my head scolded me for picking it up. But I couldn't stop. Something compelled me to cradle this grotesque artifact. Distant thunder rumbled overhead, and I glanced nervously at the silent orphanage building. No one appeared in the windows. It was just me, the statue, and the swirling sky. I tucked the statue under my jacket, closed the chest, and shoved it back into the hole. The old wood felt brittle, as if it might splinter in my hands, but I managed to bury it quickly. For reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to bring the statue inside without letting anyone know. And so I did just that. That night, the dormitory lights flickered as I sneaked under the warm blankets of my assigned bed. The old building groaned in the wind, vents rattling with a hollow moan. The statue was hidden beneath my pillow, and every time I laid my head down, I felt it pressing against my skull in a way that made restful sleep impossible. The dorm held about 10 boys, all around my age or younger, each of us with widely varying tempers and fears. Most nights, I managed to tune them out, but tonight, I couldn't stop hearing the statue's weight shift as I moved. Each slight movement seemed to draw me deeper into a silent conversation with it. Exhaustion tugged at me, eventually dragging me into a half-sleep filled with murky images. In that in-between state, my mind conjured a winding corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. I moved down this corridor with hesitant steps, one hand trailing along the clammy walls. A set of doors branched off at odd intervals, each slightly ajar, as though beckoning me inside. But as I got closer, the doors slammed shut with a thunderous crash that made me jolt awake. When I opened my eyes, my bunkmates were still. Regular breathing indicated they remained deep in slumber. The statue pressed against my ribs now, having shifted during the night. Even in the darkness, I sensed its presence, heavy and silent beside me. I closed my eyes again, trying not to think about the creeping dread, but it was impossible to ignore. Just before sleep reclaimed me, I heard faint whispers in the darkness, soft, indecipherable, yet undeniably real. Morning arrived with the diluted sun peeking through the large, dusty windows of the orphanage cafeteria. I lined up for breakfast, a bland helping of oatmeal ladled onto my tray. The statue was still wrapped under a bundle of cloth in my pocket. I couldn't leave it behind in the dorm, where someone might find it while sweeping. Neither did I want to hide it outside. A bizarre sense of possessiveness had grown in me overnight, as if this unsettling object belonged with me now. The caretaker on duty, Mr. Thorne, a wiry man with sunken cheeks, watched me from across the room with curious eyes. Usually, he ignored me completely, but that morning his gaze felt piercing. I ate in silence, barely noticing the lukewarm taste of the oatmeal, and tried not to draw attention to myself. My stomach churned with not only hunger but nerves. After breakfast, our schedule called for a few hours of classroom studies in the orphanage's makeshift schoolroom. I hated it. The windowless room smelled of chalk and old books, and the adult supervisors droned on about multiplication tables or geography, hoping something would stick with us. My mind drifted, consumed by thoughts of the statue in my pocket. Beside me sat Hal, a short kid who had a habit of doodling monsters on scrap paper. Normally I would have found his drawing silly, but that day each scribble made me flinch. Monsters with hollow eyes and twisted limbs reminded me too much of the thing I'd taken from the art. By late morning, my restlessness became overwhelming. During the short break, I slipped away from the group, searching for a private spot to examine the statue more closely. An old supply closet in a back hallway offered the isolation I craved. I flipped on the single flickering light, locked the door behind me, and sank to the floor. With trembling fingers, I removed the wrappings. The statue's dark surface gleamed with a certain slickness, as if coated by something other than just old varnish. No matter the angle, the features looked distorted. A shiver rattled through me as I thought I saw the triangular markings shift. Of course, it had to be my imagination, but did wooden carvings sometimes appear to breathe? "You found me," came a faint voice that resonated straight into my skull. The lips of the statue didn't move, there were no real lips at all, but that voice might as well have been embedded in my mind. My heart lurched. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream as the statue's presence smothered the small closet. Something about that moment felt surreal, like a half-forgotten dream. The light overhead flickered, plunging me temporarily into shadows. I asked myself if I was going insane when I heard the voice again, clearer now. It told me it was bound to me, that our fates were intertwined. My stomach twisted painfully, and beads of sweat rolled down my temples. Maybe I had accepted nightmares as real. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality. Or perhaps the statue truly was cursed, capable of speaking to me without a sound. A scraping noise drew my attention to the door. Someone rattled the doorknob. My head spun. Panic flared through me. If I was discovered here, I wouldn't be able to explain the object. If the strange goings-on were more than just in my head, I had no way to protect myself. I quickly rewrapped the statue and stuffed it into the deepest part of my jacket pocket. The doorknob jiggled again, and I opened the door, feigning innocence. Standing there was Hal, jaws parted in confusion, as though he'd had no idea I was inside. "What are you doing?" he asked, peering over my shoulder at the cramped interior. I swallowed, forcing out a response. "Nothing. Just looking for some school supplies." He looked unconvinced but shrugged after a brief, awkward silence. "Well, the bell's about to ring. You should come back." Without another word, he vanished down the hallway. I closed the closet door behind me, noticing my palms still slick with sweat. The statue seemed to throb against my chest, radiating a subtle warmth now. It was the first hint that the object might have traits beyond inexplicable whispering, some manifestation of energy. The thought tightened my throat with fear and fascination. Every evening, the orphanage set aside a couple hours for chores. I was assigned to the laundry room, which was damp and sweltering from the row of hot dryers lined against one wall. Thick gray pipes snaked overhead, turning the room into a claustrophobic tunnel of steam. I hauled baskets of clothes, pairs of socks turning inside out, occasional mismatched shirts. While I shoved a new load in, my mind replayed the statue's voice. I kept wishing, both fervently and fearfully, that it would speak again, to confirm I wasn't just an overexcited kid with a runaway imagination. As the dryers rumbled and hissed, I smelled something foul, like rotting earth. My heart skipped a beat. Instinctively, I reached for the statue in my pocket. Something stirred. The laundry room door creaked open, letting in a cold draft. I whirled around, but no one stood there. Instead, I was greeted by flickering overhead lights, a strobe effect making the room's shadows lurch and sway. The smell intensified, and a wave of dizziness buckled my knees. I gripped the edge of a table to steady myself. The statue felt impossibly hot, its edges biting into my flesh. An image burst unbidden into my mind. I saw a place of dense darkness, lit faintly by red luminescence, with shapes skittering across a stone floor slick with some viscous fluid. Their outlines suggested creatures with multiple limbs, gnarled and jointed in ways that made no sense on Earth. My stomach lurched. Then the image dissipated, leaving me reeling. The door slammed shut. Lights stabilized. The laundry room looked normal again, but the memory of that other place lingered. I tried to gather my wits. If the statue could summon such intense visions, then it must be truly cursed. Part of me was thrilled. Another part, the rational part, urged me to get rid of it immediately. I clung to the hamper, focusing on the mundane feel of the rough burlap, struggling to steady my breath. I told myself I just needed answers. If I could learn something, anything, about it, perhaps I could break its hold on me. If it even had a hold on me at all. Dinner was a subdued affair. Most of the other kids bickered among themselves about petty things, kitchen chores, who got to watch the flickering old TV next, who hogged the shower in the morning. I stayed quiet on the fringes, occasionally picking at my stew but not really tasting it. A churning sense of unease had taken up residence in my stomach. That night, in my bunk, I again heard the statue. Only the voice was louder, more insistent. It beckoned me in the hush of lights out, weaving promises among the faint snores of my bunkmates. Power, belonging, knowledge. The words seeped into my consciousness from some intangible place. A compulsion stirred within me to obey. I found myself inching out of bed, the floorboards cool beneath my bare feet. The statue's presence tugged me forward. Somehow, I drifted past the sleeping caretaker and out the back door. The night air was a chilling embrace, but a sense of destiny pushed me on. I carried the statue close to my chest, uncertain where I was going or why. I only knew that the compulsion dragged me toward the very spot where I'd found the box. Clouds obscured the stars, and my breaths formed faint puffs of vapor in the cold. The soil still bore signs of earlier rainfall, and I slipped more than once, nearly toppling face first into the dirt. At last I reached a patch of disturbed ground. The wind howled through the tangled hedges that bordered the yard. My heart pounded a frantic tattoo in my ears. The voice told me to dig anew. I thrust my hands into the damp earth. It was as though I had no choice. Loosened dirt parted under my fingers, and soon the tarnished wooden chest re-emerged. I brushed clumps of soil from its surface. The twisted symbols on its lid seemed to glow under the faint moonlight. Without hesitation, as if guided by an unseen force, I placed the statue inside. The wind died, leaving behind a silence so complete that I could hear my own blood pulsing in my veins. The hush pressed against me, expectant. Suddenly, the statue's voice cried out. No words, only a long, keening howl that resonated through my bones. The chest snapped shut of its own accord, sealing the sound inside. My breath came in ragged gasps. What was I supposed to do next? I had no clue. Before I could decide, the ground beneath me shuddered. A spider web of cracks spread outward, forming a circle around the chest. Then, with a sickening crunch, the ground collapsed a few inches, swallowing the chest deeper. I scrambled backward, terror numbing my limbs. Darkness yawned in that shallow crater. My thoughts whirled like a frightened swarm of hornets. Yet, just as quickly as it had begun, the shaking subsided. The yard fell still. The chest, half buried, lay silent. Somehow, I knew the curse was only beginning. Barely an hour later, I found myself huddled in my bunk, blankets drawn tight around me like a feeble shield. My clothes were caked with dirt, my fingernails ragged from digging. Had any of the other kids seen me leave? If so, none made any sign. They slumbered on, unaffected by the bizarre events that had just transpired. My heart refused to slow, pounding as if the statue still vibrated in my hands. Night passed in trembling fits of uneasy dozing. When morning arrived, I was exhausted, heart and mind consumed by dread. I dragged myself out of bed and changed clothes, trying to hide any sign of my midnight outing. Something inside me had shifted. The caretaker's scolding, the other kids' chatter, even the routine of chores and studies felt like an echo of a distant world. All day, I went through the motions, nodding at instructions, responding with monosyllables. Yet a part of me was always somewhere else, braced for the next impossible occurrence. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, scanning the yard for any sign of the chest rising back to the surface. The numbness in my fingertips refused to fade, as if I had been holding on to ice for hours. The orphanage collectively noticed my altered mood. Kids walked a bit more cautiously around me, and even Mr. Thorne sported an anxious glimmer whenever our gazes met. Questions formed in my bunkmates' eyes, but no one dared ask. Maybe they chalked it up to teenage sulking or leftover guilt from the scuffle that had landed me in yard duty. But if only they knew, 2 nights after burying the statue again, the dreams started. They were vivid, grotesque, and disturbingly enthralling. In these dreams, I saw long corridors that snaked through ancient structures, their walls etched with symbols I recognized from the chest. I moved through these corridors, passing locked doors behind which inhuman snarls and moans echoed. My fear grew with each step, yet I couldn't stop. A deep, resonant hum pulsed through the dream's air, aligning with the steady drum of my heartbeat. Eventually, I'd reach a massive door, carved in the same style as the chest. The door would creak open a sliver, bathing me in a red glow that promised horrors and power in equal measure. I'd wake drenched in sweat, stifling a scream in the stale darkness of the dormitory. During the day, I caught myself drifting away, mind lost in an undercurrent of insidious thoughts. Whispers in my head, softer than before, urged me to retrieve the statue again. Not for me, they insisted, but for something far larger than me. I tried to resist, clung to a semblance of normalcy, but each passing moment felt like an avalanche, unstoppable and inevitable. Eventually, I snapped under the statue's unrelenting call. One night, half in a sleepwalking state, I crept through the orphanage's silent halls. My steps were near soundless on the old wooden floors. The place smelled of warm dust and stale soup. Shivering with dread, I exited out the back door once more. My chest felt constricted, but something beyond my control guided my feet. Starlight glinted on the wet grass as I approached the place where the chest was buried. The soil had settled into a shallow dip. A circle of eerily wilted plants surrounded the spot, yellowed leaves drooping in a ring. I knelt to the dirt, carefully removed the grass, and dug with my bare hands. The ground parted more easily than before, as though it recognized me. Within moments, I uncovered the chest again. Somehow, the latch no longer seemed rusted. It opened smoothly, revealing the statue exactly as I'd left it. But it now bore changes. The triangular markings along its chest had grown deeper, and there were fresh symbols carved into its torso, resembling swirling loops much like those on the chest's exterior. My breath caught. The statue was changing, evolving. For an agonizing beat, I wanted to fling it away, to bury it forever, to run until daylight. But it beckoned me to cradle it again. The moment my fingers touched its wooden surface, a jolt of raw energy coursed through my body. The orchard of terrifying visions sprang to life behind my eyelids. I glimpsed swirling shapes and heard unearthly cries. It was as if I'd awakened some primal force that had slept for eons beneath the ground. My senses reeled. The statue's voice returned, more assertive than ever. It demanded a gesture of devotion. The whispered order slid into my thoughts like a blade. A sacrifice. I jerked my hands back, heart pounding. "No!" I hissed at the statue. Fear and confusion warred within me. The statue's voice twisted in my head, an onslaught of persuasion. If I truly wanted to end the nightmares, said the voice, I had to offer a piece of myself, or perhaps a piece of someone else. The voice gave me twisted images of blood and chanting, of me standing in the yard with lifeless bodies at my feet, of eyes wide with horror. My stomach lurched. I gagged, wretched, and spat into the soil. Desperate not to do what it asked, I instead showered the statue with curses, telling it to leave me alone. My voice rose in frantic pleas, tears streaming down my cheeks. Finally, a hush descended. I slumped onto the cold grass, breath ragged as adrenaline coursed through my veins. The statue's voice went quiet again, though I could still feel its anger thrumming in my thoughts. In trembling defiance, I replaced the statue in the chest, snapped the lid shut, and buried it deeper than ever, covering it with rocks and soil. Then, as if that would suffice, I turned and stumbled back to bed. What followed was a week of half-mad anxiety. My nightmares escalated, each dream more terrifying than the last. I'd see children from the orphanage twisted into monstrous shapes, crawling on walls, their eyes blank. In one vision, I witnessed Mr. Thorne's skeleton tear free from his flesh. In another, I found myself shouting nonsense at a swirling void while the building burned behind me. My grades in class, never impressive, plummeted. I snapped at the other kids and avoided them at the same time. Whispers about me spread through the orphanage. I was losing my mind, that's what they said. Maybe they were right. Odd occurrences spread beyond my personal experiences. Doors slammed on their own. The old pipes rattled at night, moaning like wounded beasts. One of the younger kids woke up screaming about a shadow in his room. Mr. Thorne blamed it on overactive imaginations, but I saw how his hands trembled each time an unexplained gust blew through the hallways. The worst part was the statue's absence in my pocket, leaving a phantom ache. I'd catch myself subconsciously reaching for it, as if it belonged pressed against my side. Its evil, parasitic influence was burrowing deeper into my being, refusing to let me break free. Sometimes I thought I heard it call my name from outside, a rasping echo that slipped through closed windows. Every day, my resolve to keep it buried weakened. Finally, in an agony of confusion, I decided to confide in someone. That person, unexpectedly, turned out to be Hal. I had no close friends in the orphanage, but Hal was the only one who had shown a modicum of interest in what was going on with me, aside from mocking me on occasion. I lured him away from the watchful eyes of staff, leading him to a dingy corner by the boiler room where the roaring machinery masked our conversation. I told him about discovering the chest, about the statue, about the visions and nightmares. He didn't speak for a very long time. His face didn't even twitch with disbelief. Instead, he looked at me as if I'd validated something he'd always suspected. A tension in his voice suggested he knew more than he let on. "You have to get rid of it," Hal finally said, unwavering. "Really get rid of it," I bristled. "I tried. I buried it multiple times. It won't stay away. It's in my head, Hal." Panic flared in my voice. "I don't know what to do," he exhaled, glancing at the humming pipes overhead. "Maybe we smash it or burn it to ash. I've heard stories about cursed objects. Sometimes you have to destroy them beyond recognition." His suggestion filled me with equal measures of hope and dread. Destroy the statue? A part of me recoiled from the idea, as though losing something vital. Another part lunged at the notion. Forget consequences. Maybe that was the only path to freedom. Eventually, I nodded. "All right," I said, swallowing hard. "We'll try." We planned to meet at midnight the following day, slip out into the yard, and dig up the chest. Then we'd perform an impromptu funeral pyre, turning the statue into smoldering ruin. The plan was risky, but the mere thought of it gave me a spark of courage. The next night arrived with thick clouds overhead, and a faint drizzle began to coat every surface in watery sheen. I grabbed a flashlight from a supply cabinet, wrapped it in cloth to dim the beam, and met Hal at the back door. Before stepping out, I felt the statue's presence beckoning me again. My gut clenched, but I pushed the feeling aside. This had to be done. We navigated the yard in near total darkness. The wind hissed through the tall hedges, and mud clung to our shoes. Once the flashlight's feeble glow fell on the shallow depression in the earth, I knew we were at the right place. The soil was loose, as if something had been shifting beneath. Hal and I started digging, our hands caked with slick dirt in seconds. Rocks scraped our palms. My breathing came in short bursts. Eventually, the battered chest came into view once more. Hal pried it free from the mud. Raindrops glinted on its tarnished surface. I could almost hear a hiss from within, an invisible protest. Rather than open it there, we carried the chest a short distance to a pile of old bricks and twisted scrap. It was the safest place for a fire, given that the staff rarely ventured there. Gathering bits of kindling and broken wood, we built an impromptu pyre. Lightning flashed in the distance. We'd have to move quickly. Thunder rumbled as Hal forced the chest open. The statue looked even more contorted, its limbs elongated in ways that defied logic. My heart hammered so fiercely I thought I might faint. A pulse of dark energy radiated from it, making the air feel suffocating around us. Hal's face twitched with a mix of fear and determination. "Let's do it," he said, his voice unsteady. I flicked the lighter in my hand, shielded the flame from the raindrops until it caught on a scrap of dry newspaper we'd found. A tiny flickering glow blossomed into hungry flames. We positioned the chest so the statue would be consumed first. Smoke soon wafted upward, thick and pungent. To accelerate the process, we added more scraps of wood. Sparks jumped in the wet air. For a heartbeat, I thought we'd succeeded. A sense of relief began to unfurl in my chest. But then, the flames abruptly sputtered out. As though an invisible wind had snuffed them in one motion, the fire died, leaving only trails of black smoke behind. Hal and I gaped at each other. I grabbed the lighter again, trying once more to ignite the pile. The same thing happened. The fire started, burned for a few seconds, and was extinguished by some unseen hand. Panic spiked. A tangible sense of malevolence emanated from the statue. Steam rose off its carved surface, as though the flames had warmed it but done no damage. We both recoiled. Thunder shook the ground beneath us. "Something's stopping the fire," Hal said, voice trembling. Desperate, I seized a nearby brick. "Then we'll smash it," I hissed, testosterone and terror surging in my veins. Hal joined me, and we pounded the statue with bricks, half mad in our frantic desire to destroy the cursed thing. The chest splintered easily, but the statue refused to crack. Each blow made the wood ring with an unnatural resonance. A few shallow chips flew off, but the shape remained intact. When I swung with all my might, the statue seemed to vibrate, nearly knocking me off balance. Hal let out a gasping curse, staggering back. His eyes blazed with dread. That was when we heard laughter, low, guttural. It had no identifiable origin. It was everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the raindrops. My blood ran cold. The sound melded into 1,000 whispers, mocking our efforts. I dropped the brick, chest heaving. "It can't be destroyed," I breathed, on the verge of hysteria. "What do we do?" He shook his head, face pale. I don't know." Cradled in the wrecked chest, the statue's carved face seemed to grin at me. I expected the voice in my head to speak, but I heard nothing. Fear radiated through me like a sickness. The skies opened, unleashing a torrential downpour. In the staccato of the rain, Hal and I fled as lightning thundered overhead. After that disastrous attempt, Hal fell ill. His skin turned almost translucent, veins spidery beneath. He spent most of the next day lying in the infirmary. A fever racked his body, and he mumbled incoherent words, occasionally yelping in terror. I could only guess he was having nightmares much like mine, perhaps worse. Guilt tore at me like a ravenous beast. I had dragged him into this. If not for me, he would be free of the curse. Meanwhile, the entire orphanage began to feel wrong. The fluorescent lights in the hallways flickered at odd intervals. Pipes gurgled nonstop, carrying eerie echoes that sometimes sounded like anguished wails. Several children complained of hearing footsteps following them, even when no one was there. A staff member disappeared for a full day, only to be found wandering the grounds, babbling about. Dark figures in the yard. All of these events pointed to one truth: the curse was spreading. Despair hollowed me out. The caretaker, Mr. Thorne, interrogated me a few times about what I knew, but I lied, insisting ignorance. How could I possibly explain that I had caused these horrors by unearthing a monstrous object from the dirt? On the rare occasion I visited Hal at the infirmary, I'd see fear dancing in his feverish eyes. He'd grab my arm and whisper nonsense about doors and corridors, about shapes crawling in the walls. I recognized those nightmares all too well. Then he'd lapse into delirium. Late at night, I wondered how long until the statue demanded something more than just torment. Would it claim victims? Would it drive me to commit greater atrocities? In my restless anguish, I decided that I alone had to seal the statue's power or banish it entirely. If destroying it was impossible, then perhaps returning it to wherever it came from was my last option. The statue itself, or its voice, had not spoken to me since that night in the yard, but the nightmares gave me clues. I kept seeing those corridors made of stone, etched with symbols, leading to a chamber filled with a swirling red glow. The same swirling patterns that adorned the chest and the statue reappeared in my dreams. A desperate plan formed in my mind. I would perform a ritual, something to confine the curse or seal it away. Admittedly, I had no clue how, but my dreams hinted at gestures and words that might work. On the night of the attempt, I left the dormitory well after midnight, my breath misting in the cold. The orphanage felt still as a graveyard. Each step resonated in the quiet. The caretaker was either asleep or too terrified to walk the halls. I carried a stolen candle, a pocket knife, some chalk, and a battered old book about myths and legends I'd found in a storage room. Once I reached the yard, I made my way to the mound of upturned earth. The sky was black except for the occasional faint flicker of lightning in the distance. A rotting stench filled the air. I pushed aside the debris from our previous attempt. The statue lay exposed on top of the chest's remnants, unaffected by weather. Reaching out, I lifted it with trembling hands. Its surface felt feverishly hot, and I nearly dropped it when it moved. Yes, the wood itself moved, squirming in my grasp like a living creature. Bile rose in my throat. Steadying myself, I propped up the candle on a flat rock, lit it with shaking fingers, and then flipped open the old book. Its pages smelled of dust and mold. My plan was a haphazard mix of dream-inspired recollections and random incantations from the book's scribbled notes. I drew a large circular symbol around me on the ground using the chalk, copying patterns from a dream. Then I cut my palm with the pocket knife, wincing as blood welled up. Red droplets dripped onto the chalk, smudging into the design. The statue's presence bore down on me with suffocating intensity, as though an unspeakable being hovered inches away. In a quavering voice, I recited words that I wasn't even sure how to pronounce, combined with bits of nonsense from my nightmares. The candle flame elongated, flickering ominously in the breeze. The night air grew impossibly cold, gnawing at my bones. My breath came in frantic gasps, each word scraping my throat. For a moment, I felt like a mere vessel for something far older and hungrier than I could comprehend. The statue hissed. I heard it plainly this time, as though it possessed lungs capable of expelled breath. A swirl of fog seeped from its hollow eyes, coiling around my ankles. My chalk circle glowed faintly, responding to the mingling of my blood and the incantation. Thunder rolled. The ground shook beneath me, reminiscent of the first time I'd found the chest. I continued to chant, forcing the words out, half hoping, half pleading for them to work. As the tremors intensified, the statue let out a sharp, unearthly shriek that drilled into my skull, threatening to obliterate my consciousness. Black shapes appeared at the edges of my vision, swirling with savage excitement, like intangible beasts waiting to break free. But the more I chanted, the more the circle glowed and the more those shapes hesitated. It felt like a standoff between the powers invoked by the statue and whatever minor force my ritual had mustered. Then came a flash of light that split the sky. For one terrifying instant, I glimpsed a vast silhouette looming above us, impossible in scale, bristling with writhing limbs. My mind reeled at the suggestion of its shape, an abomination that I had neither words nor comprehension for. I squeezed my eyes shut, still chanting, tears and sweat staining my face. The statue's shriek rose to a crescendo. My eardrums felt on the brink of bursting. I pressed my bloody palm to the statue's carved chest. "Begone!" I roared, or something to that effect. The wind swept in, howling, an unnatural gale swirling dust, leaves, and bits of debris around me. The circle's chalk lines flared brighter. Suddenly, the statue lurched in my hands, and I felt the disorienting pull, like gravity flipping sideways. The nightmares I'd endured bled into reality. My surroundings flickered between the orphanage yard and that subterranean corridor. I saw momentary glimpses of monstrous silhouettes trapped behind doors. The swirling red glow pulsed in the distance. Blood dripped from my palm onto the statue, and I felt a jolt, as though the cursed being and I were forging a final connection. Or perhaps I was severing our bond. An air-splitting boom rang out. The candle snuffed out, plunging the yard into darkness. My circle's glow vanished instantly. Thunder echoed overhead, rattling my teeth. I toppled backward, the statue slipping from my hands. Its shrieking cut off like a switch had been flipped. For several heartbeats, I lay in the wet grass, stunned by the abrupt silence. When I struggled to my feet, I realized that the statue was gone, not broken or shattered. Gone, as if it had never been. All that remained was the soggy mud, disturbed footprints, and the faint trace of my chalk circle. A faint odor of rotten soil lingered along with the tang of ozone. My body trembled, balancing on the edge of shock. My mind teetered between relief and disbelief. The sight was quiet, no horrifying shapes, no monstrous silhouette. The yard was once again just the yard. Life at the orphanage assumed an uneasy calm in the following days. The unexplained phenomena gradually ceased. No more mysterious footsteps in the halls, no abrupt flickering of lights, no inhuman noises from the pipes. Hal recovered from his fever without memory of the final ritual, but he wore a wary expression whenever he saw me. I didn't push him for details. I could still sense faint echoes of the statue's power drifting in the corners of my memory, yet something fundamental had shifted. For my part, the nightmares no longer haunted me. Sleep returned to normal. Still, I couldn't say my soul was at peace. I felt a permanent scar, an awareness that the world we inhabit might brush up against unnerving horrors beyond our comprehension. Sometimes, I jerked awake at night, expecting to hear the statue's whisper, but there was only silence. Weeks bled into months. I avoided the backyard as much as possible, preferring to distract myself with the orphanage's daily grind. Hal and I occasionally exchanged knowing glances, but we never discussed that night. Perhaps we feared conjuring the statue's influence again by speaking of it. The other children mostly forgot the strange events, content to focus on mundane gossip. Mr. Thorne left me alone, probably relieved that the weirdness had dissipated. Only once did I dare revisit the spot. It was a brisk, cloudy afternoon on a weekend. I ventured there with a carefully measured stride, scanning the ground for any trace of the chest or the missing statue. Not a single scrap remained. The soil endured my gaze with indifferent silence. As I knelt, I detected a subtle earthen imprint, shaped vaguely like the outlines of the cursed artifacts I had buried. Yet that mark could easily have been my imagination. I left the place without a backward glance. Deep inside, I knew that although the statue had vanished, the memory of it lived on as a quiet terror. The horrors I saw in those subterranean corridors, the ancient power behind that wooden shape, those things were not illusions. They had brushed against our reality, leaving fear in their wake. I had survived, though not entirely unscathed. Sometimes, just before dawn, I awake and recall the impossibly large silhouette that tore open the stormy sky, its limbs writhing over the orphanage. In that fleeting moment between sleep and consciousness, I feel as though the statue isn't truly gone. It might be hidden somewhere else, in another yard, waiting for some other unsuspecting soul to release it. Worse yet, it might be waiting for me to lose vigilance, so it can reclaim the hold it once had over my life. Yet for all my dread, I find a grim reassurance that I acted. By confronting the curse, I may have given us all a chance to move on. Though I remain uneasy, I keep going. The orphanage's daily rhythms continue, and I'm part of them, if only half-heartedly. My perspective on ghosts, curses, and nightmares will never be the same. But as I glance across the yard from a window on a rainy evening, I take solace in the emptiness there. No twisted statue peeks from the soil. No monstrous laughter echoes in the wind. I can breathe again, if only just. And so, I live with my memories, carrying the burden of what might have been, and might still be. Let others remain blissfully ignorant. My eyes stay open. Perhaps that is enough.